9. Concluding remarks. Palestine issue is the just cause of a people who fell victim to an organized settler colonialist project that sought to establish a Jewish state through conquest and by forcibly changing the demographic structure of Palestine. The result was the Nakba of 1948. A regime of the settler colonialist state that emerged took the shape of an ethnocracy, and then Israel occupied the rest of Palestine in 1967 and came to rule directly over the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza, the shape of an apartheid-like system of kibush and nishal that can be called in short an Israeli apartheid regime. Palestinians already possessed a national consciousness, aspirations, and a national leadership, while the Zionist movement was working as a settler colonial project in Palestine to realize its own self-described national ambition of a Jewish state in Palestine. Its project could not be implemented without ethnic cleansing and commieing associacide politicide against their Palestinians, entailing atrocities such as massacres and looting and armed robbery in the middle of the 20th century. Self-justification, cognitive dissonance, amnesia and mythology needed to maintain the sanity of a civilized society, the commission of such acts have been constituent components of the settler society culture in the new state, which effectively pursued the task of nation building. Is clear instance of settler colonialism, which took root in Palestine. Palestine during the age of decolonization has been particularly complicated and vexatious due to the conjuncture of the Jewish question and the Arab question, and the imperialist partition of the Arab Levant. Both issues and their impact were discussed at length in the RST part of this book. It may not be fair that the Palestinians, the people of a small Arab country on the eastern Mediterranean coast, have had to endure the consequences of complex European, American and Arab histories, ideologies and regime interests, but history is neither fair nor unfair. It is the reality that has heretofore hindered the imposition of a just, or relatively just, solution on Israel, and it is incumbent upon Israel to face this fact. Victims of colonialism are not the good guys in a movie, nor is the colonialist society made up of bad guys. Victims should not be expected to always do the right thing or consistently take the moral high ground, as some 241 intellectuals seem to believe or expect them to do. Nevertheless, Palestinian elites, especially the political leadership, are required to maintain a liberation ethos while also adopting a democratic program. Other colonized nations gained their independence without having to incessantly account for the words and deeds of their leadership, but, unfortunately, due to the aforementioned complexities, the Palestinians do not have this luxury. In no phases of the Con-ICT were Zionism and Israel the victims. Additionally, they were never the few against the many. Occupiers' monopolization of victimhood and the collusion of the major Western powers, especially successive U.S. administrations, with this deception is just one of the discursive dimensions upholding and continually reproducing the settler colonial status quo. Palestinian calamity began in 1948, when the Palestinians were expelled from their homeland by organized settler militias that perceived themselves to be a national movement and tried to change the demography of Palestine and establish a Jewish state. Is similarly the origin of the Arab-Israeli Con-ICT. Disingenuous attempts to start the debate from the occupation of 1967 deliberately distort history for political ends. Memory of Palestine before 1948 is important not only on the level of personal identity, but also politically. Acknowledgement of this memory is what makes the acceptance of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, or the acceptance of equality in a binational state in Palestine, historical compromises. Moreover, we are no longer talking solely about an intangible Palestinian collective memory. By refuting dominant Israeli myths about the Nakba and rewriting the history of Palestine before 1948 to describe and document the ethnic cleansing of its people, Palestinian and Israeli critical historians have proven that writing history, even in an academic framework, is no longer the sole privilege of the victor. Most Palestinians became refugees. Israel refused to implement the right of return according to UN Resolution 194, and the West Bank fell under Jordanian and Gaza under Egyptian administrations. A few Palestinians who managed to remain in their homeland became Israeli citizens and lived under martial law until 1966. A state denied itself as a Jewish state and a state for Jews, treating its Arab citizens as if they were foreigners in their own country. Is the nation of the nation and the state is the root of the many contradictions inherent in the conception of Israel as an exclusivist democracy. 242. For the Jews, many of whom are not citizens of Israel and belong to other, mostly democratic, nations. Over time, it has led to a unique congruence between extremist nationalism and religious fundamentalism in a militarized Israeli society, despite seeming to be independent, and even antagonistic, ideological positions at Zionism's outset. Initially a product of the interaction between Palestinian initiatives and the Arab order under the leadership of the Pan-Arab Camp, the PLO succeeded in building an institutional national entity and becoming the recognized representative of the Palestinian people as a liberation movement, especially after 1967, when the factions engaged in armed struggle controlled the organization. The 1967 war was not a defensive war, it was an aggressive war. Israel planned to defeat the Pan-Arab regimes building modern states and armies, especially Nasserite Egypt. It also intended to annex territories in the West Bank and to use the occupied territories in Sinai and the Golan Heights as a bargaining chip in order to conclude an unconditional peace with Egypt and Syria without resolving the question of Palestine. For the Arab regimes, this meant capitulation or a military defeat. East Jerusalem was annexed and the settlement project in the newly occupied territories was launched. After the 1967 war, the secular modern settler colonial state came to be increasingly identified with the mythical biblical land of Israel, Eretz Israel. A religious component in Zionism, inherent in the definition of the nation and its connection to Palestine, expressed itself through a religious nationalist ideology that gave birth to a new colonialist settler project in the West Bank. Its ideology gradually moved to the mainstream of Israeli society. A bilateral peace between Egypt and Israel, 1979, demonstrated Israel's perception of the Palestinian issue as independent of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It facilitated Israel's 1967 war goal of forcing Arab countries to accept peace agreements with Israel in exchange for the territories occupied in 1967, but without justice for the Palestinians. Bilateralism as a way to retrieve the occupied territories proved to be an exclusive Egyptian-Israeli model that did not apply for other Arab countries and the PLO or the Oslo Accords. Once Egypt was removed from the conflict, threats of war by neighboring Arab states immediately lost all credibility and Israel had no motivation to return. 243. Any of the territories occupied in 1967. Any ostensible future threat to Israeli security would come from armed resistance movements. Egypt's separate peace lent a new significance to the Arab official recognition of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, changing the way Arab regimes, which see peace with Israel as the key to America's heart, viewed the conflict. In a nutshell, the Palestine question became the problem of the Palestinians. Arab regimes might, or might not, offer assistance and support, but it was no longer their shared responsibility. His position not only distorts history, but also lies in the face of prevailing Arab public opinion. One Palestinian intifada forced Israel to address the Palestinian question and sit down with the PLO, which was experiencing a profound crisis after the War for Kuwait, 1991, and the collapse of the Arab Order and the Soviet Union. In exchange for recognition, the PLO was ready to give up its hard-won status as a national liberation movement and become a subordinate authority under Israeli sovereignty. That was the actual substance of the Oslo Accords, which were not based on the mutual acceptance of key principles as peace negotiations typically are. Instead, the peace process consolidated the unequal balance of power between colonizer and colonized, unfolding in line with the pro-Israel bias of the US and Israeli domestic consensus. That consensus currently rejects withdrawal to the pre-June 1967 borders, including East Jerusalem, the dismantlement of settlements and a just solution to the refugee issue, the three Israeli no's. Explained in Chapter 4. An increasingly right-wing Israeli society treats their Palestinians only as a demographic problem. At best, it may agree to jeison the most heavily Arab-populated centers while keeping the rest. A formula is a disclosed secret: maximum land, minimum Arabs. The Oslo Accords cleared the way for many countries in the Global South to develop relations with Israel. The agreement was not the actual reason for the normalization of bilateral relations, but it provided a handy excuse: if the Palestinians did it, so can everyone else. A second intifada, the US need for Arab allies in the war on Iraq, 2003, and the US desire to refute accusations of double standards forced Israel's hand. Acting to preempt an American roadmap for peace, it chose to withdraw from the most populated part of the occupied territories, the Gaza. 244. Strip and intensify the settler colonial project in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The effective thwarting of a Palestinian state, the aggressive expansion of settlements, and Israel's separation policies, including the construction of a separation wall, are the key features of the apartheid system instituted in Palestine. Its system is an extension of settler colonialism, and not merely an occupation by our normal state, e.g., a nativized settler colonial state, of the land of another state, the occupied state of Palestine, which is a member of the UN. An anti-apartheid campaign is therefore justly led by the nature of this regime. The US did not pressure Israel to re-energize the peace process because of its close strategic alignment with Israel, the influence of the Israeli lobby in Washington and domestic politics, and the absence of Arab official pressure. In the Trump era, this close alignment turned into a total identification with the positions and ideology of the Israeli nationalist religious right. Intersection between the distinct biblical theology of evangelical Christian Zionism and the extreme Israeli right produced a new US policy position on Palestine. A Trump-Netanyahu peace initiative, the so-called deal of the century, not only accentuated the US pro-Israel alignment, but also managed to assemble in a single text all the shibboleths about Palestine found in Israeli propaganda and Zionist religious nationalist narratives. These developments have raised profound questions about the usefulness of a Palestinian strategy based solely on US-sponsored peace negotiations. Chapter 7, which discussed this issue, provided an opportunity to refute the unfounded myth of Arab rejectionism and show that, to the contrary, Israel has spurned peace initiatives as a consistent policy. It also offered the chance for a close textual analysis of the persistent myths and fallacies of Israeli propaganda that found their way into an official American peace proposal. A way forward. Look for strategies, not solutions. A path ahead requires engaging in a democratic national struggle for justice and equality. A species political model under which justice and equality will be realized will only crystallize over the course of the struggle and through long dialogue once certain principles have been accepted. A political system may eventually take the form of a single binational state or two states. In both cases, the system should be an inclusive state for all its 245. Citizens, with the Palestinian state maintaining its Arab character and the Israeli state maintaining its Jewish character. Both models can address the issues of refugees and citizenship, and neither will arise from current negotiations. Nevertheless, this book does not approach the discussion from the perspective of solutions because colonialism and apartheid are not dilemmas requiring creative remedies. EY are unjust institutionalized regimes that must be resisted, and no realistic, viable and just solution is imaginable under prevailing conditions, whether premised on a one-state or two-state solution. A political reorientation may be necessary to move away from the existing negotiations towards a long-term struggle to achieve justice for the Palestinian people. There are no negotiations on the horizon promising a one-state solution in place of their two-state solution that negotiations have failed to construct. Hence, I am not discussing solutions here, but instead emphasizing the struggle for justice in all of Palestine. After the Nakba, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement quickly gained a foothold in the diaspora, in refugee camps and among educated middle-class Palestinians abroad, becoming the movement of the Palestinian people as a whole. When it was reduced to a truncated political entity in the West Bank and Gaza, it triggered a process of fragmentation that soon split it into two different parts, one in the West Bank and the other in the Gaza Strip, each with its own political agenda and interest in maintaining power. Is not a strategy, unless reproducing the status quo is the goal. Currently, each Palestinian constituency deploys different forms of resistance against the same occupying regime. Resistance will inevitably continue given the relentless struggle of living in an apartheid-like system of occupation, but a nationally coordinated strategy could revolutionize the impact of such everyday resistance. A question of strategy, however, is one for the various factions and parties and the leaders of the two Palestinian authorities. Although the latter seem uninterested in leading a liberation movement and likely incapable of it, leaders should nevertheless have answers about future programs, paths for engaging in the struggle, and prospective strategies. Is not a theoretical matter, but is directly relevant to political organization. In the case of the Palestinian people, the duty of resistance is of special importance whether liberation takes the form of a Palestinian state, coupled 246 with other provisions for the Palestinian people outside the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or a binational Arab-Jewish state or a two-state confederation. The Palestinian people would accept any one of these models provided it promises at least some degree of justice. But the Palestinian people cannot choose it unilaterally, and the apartheid regime has not seriously engaged with solutions. As such, the answer to the question, what is to be done, is this: there can be no strategy without an actor or clarity about the roles of the leadership. There is no such a thing as a theoretical political strategy absent of political organization. Analytical studies like this one can describe trends, but they cannot prescribe strategies, unless they are directed towards a species organization that has already denied its goals. Repeating clichés and slogans detached from the current political moment that only serve to preserve the identity of one particular faction or party is not an answer. How can a liberation organization develop a liberation strategy when it has been subordinated to a constrained authority with its own strategy, one that effectively incapacitates and obviates the role of the liberation organization itself? While the Israeli settlement project has continued in the West Bank throughout the so-called peace process, the PA's political efforts have been channeled into two tracks. ERST is fundraising, with its political supplements and accessories, which guarantees the survival of the PA and its ability to provide services to Palestinians living under its authority. These efforts have been hindered by repeated Israeli attempts to exercise control by exerting financial pressure whenever a conflict with the PA arises. Meanwhile, the PA has continued to carry out its vital security functions for Israel. Indeed, the Palestinian leadership has amped their achievements in security. Coordination to the Israeli public and the Western media, much to their astonishment of Arab and Palestinian audiences. A second track of Palestinian political activity has focused on efforts to join formal international bodies in order to consolidate the international status of a state. While there has been much talk of peaceful resistance, it is rarely acted upon, aside from local initiatives in villages and towns subject to land confiscations and cellular acts, or those directly impacted by the illegal separation wall. In Jerusalem, civil resistance has increased given their 247 intensified Judaization and the residents' direct contact with the occupation and the absence of the PA and its security obligations. A stagnation of the so-called peace process, the weakening of the PA by successive Israeli right-wing governments and the entrenched competition between Hamas and Fatah have increased the possibility of protests spreading to the West Bank. A more dangerous development since 2007 is the internal Palestinian Con-ICT. Power struggles erupted before a Palestinian state has even been established, and this has absorbed the energy of those involved in Palestinian politics, not just locally but in the Arab region and across the globe. When Fatah learned of Trump's deal, it was preoccupied with the question of who would succeed Abbas as PA president and with its ongoing Con-ICT with Hamas. Fatah's internal conflicts and the changing political alliances they engender, the intricacies of which are beyond the average citizen, have become a topic of everyday conversation in the West Bank, distracting Palestinians from the struggle against occupation. A Hamas authority, on the other hand, has survived the Gaza siege and gained experience in deterring Israeli acts. But it does not present an alternative, neither for a strategy of struggle against the Israeli apartheid system nor for the administration of Palestinian societal affairs. Not only did the reality of the PA and the demands of its work undermine the PLO as an instrument in the international struggle for Palestine, but it also marginalized popular solidarity movements that once supported the Palestinian struggle for liberation. EPA put all its eggs in one basket, relying exclusively on the White House as the primary mediator in negotiations. Only in Trump's term did it realize that it cannot depend on the good intentions of the US to lead the negotiations to a just peace. But instead of reviving the popular struggle against an undeniably apartheid regime, it called for the quartet to mediate the negotiations because the US was not an honest broker. Meanwhile, solidarity movements shed their anti-on to the siege of the Gaza Strip. EPLO's decline as a national liberation movement and the rise of Hamas gave the PLO's internal rivals an opportunity to Islamize the Palestine cause. It has adversely influenced public opinion in many countries and rest the erroneous conception of the Con-ICT as a religious one, which is to the benefit of Israel since it has a clear interest in portraying the question of Palestine as a primarily religious Con-ICT. 248. Moreover, the political polarization of the two rival authorities in the West Bank and Gaza has significantly undercut the symbolic valence of the Palestinian liberation movement in the Global South, formerly a major source of political support. EPA, preoccupied with the Con-ICT between the two authorities and heavily reliant on the decisions of US administrations, has gradually distanced itself from the global democratic movement of solidarity with Palestine. At the same time, however, the global solidarity movement with Palestine has been revived in recent years by courageous Palestinian civil initiatives that continue the peaceful struggle against apartheid and settlers in Jerusalem and various villages in the West Bank, and by an assertive Palestinian diaspora youth generation capitalizing on democratic liberal and laist reactions against Trump's populism and his total identification with the Israeli right. Waiting for Israeli elections. A strategy that hinges on the center one day replacing the far right in Israeli government is a lethal illusion. Israeli Zionist law is all but extinct in mainstream politics and no longer holds any meaningful political clout. Moreover, it should be remembered that during the Nakba and the 1967 war, Israel was led by the Zionist labor movement, and the two intifadas took place when the Labour Party was in power. Things did change, but nostalgia for that era is effectively a yearning for endless, futile negotiations. A real struggle for power in Israel is between the section of the right that allies itself with orthodox religious parties and the section of the right that refuses to do so because of conflicting views about rights and duties in citizenship and about religious strictures by religious parties in ruling coalitions. There are no significant or substantive differences between them on Palestine. Regardless of the coalition in government, public consensus in Israel clings to the three no's discussed earlier. But Israeli public opinion can be changed by other means, a resistance struggle that prevents the normalization of apartheid and extracts a price from the Israeli economy, a global anti-apartheid campaign that espouses a discourse of democratic justice and international pressure, especially American. A latter method requires strategies that do not rely on official Arab assistance, but on American civil society and alignments with progressive social movements, African American lobbies, Muslim American lobbies, progressive Jewish movements, etc. 249. Votes of Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel in national elections could be significant if the goal is to organize Arabs in Israel as citizens and as an ethnic national group fighting for their rights and the preservation of their Palestinian Arab identity. But any strategy that hinges on their votes to determine issues of war and peace or Israeli policy towards Palestine is doomed to fail, because it assumes that Israeli government approval for a settlement with the Palestinians would rely on a Jewish Knesset minority joined by Arab votes to outweigh the nationalist religious bloc. His fantasy underestimates the centrality of Zionism and the Jewishness of the state and overestimates Israeli democracy. It also encourages their Israelization of Arabs in a country that explicitly denies itself as a Jewish state. In tandem with Palestinization, Arab citizens are also undergoing a process of Israelization, manifested in Arab citizens' everyday lives through the exercise of various dimensions of citizenship, such as paying taxes and expecting state services, demanding access to public service, basic civil rights, appropriate school curricular and university education, and being exposed to Hebrew media and culture. These parallel processes produce cultural hybrids and raise both Palestinian national and Israeli civic consciousness and expectations. It is an inevitable organic process. Palestinians in Israel would thus marginalize any national movement that ignores the significance of their everyday demands for civil rights. Israelization beyond these pragmatic requirements, however, risks distorting both equal citizenship and national identity. The only form of assimilation that Arab politics in Israel can embrace without giving up their Palestinian identity is one based on a program aspiring to make the state one for all its citizens that also recognizes the national identity of its Palestinian citizens. Such a program grants Arabs individual civil rights as equal citizens while preserving collective rights for Palestinian Arabs inside Israel, and it is compatible with both an acceptable, relatively just two-state solution and the model of one binational state. Any other assimilationist project would ultimately compel Arab Palestinians in a Jewish state to live as half Arabs and half Israelis instead of wholly Palestinian Arabs and full citizens. 3. EPA's tendency to encourage a subgroup of Palestinians, Arab citizens of Israel, to support the Zionist centre is a grave mistake because it is based on a warped understanding of Israel. Arab citizens of Israel can 250 contribute to the liberation struggle by holding fast to their people's just cause, maintaining their identity as Palestinians and persisting in their civil struggle for equal rights as citizens in a citizenship-based state, which by definition contradicts Zionism. Moreover, experience has shown that, in Israel as it exists today, a Jewish majority is necessary for any important national policy decision to be considered legitimate. 4. Long-term resistance strategy in the occupied territories. An effective resistance movement needs a long-term plan. EPA's role is to competently administer and organize the daily affairs of Palestinians living in the regions it oversees. Given that the PA has devolved mostly into a security apparatus whose main function is to protect Israel and a service provider without sovereignty and basic rights, not even freedom of movement for its own officials, it is no surprise that many advocate for its dissolution. Not only has the PA imposed agreements on the Palestinian people that are now widely recognized as disastrous, but it has also freed the occupying power of all its responsibilities for civil governance without freeing its own people from the occupation. However, the dissolution of the PA would spark a civil war, which would destroy any remaining gains and likely end with the PA's security apparatus taking direct control with Israeli support. There is an additional dimension to consider: the PA's historical role as distinct from its political positions. The Palestinian people cannot be low without economic, educational, health, social and police institutions. Any people striving for collective liberation must sustain their ability to self-organize and care for their daily needs. The Palestinian people cannot survive, endure and develop without basic institutions and organs with the power to administer society. These institutions could be those of the existing PA, which has achieved some progress in the civil sphere, provided it can bear the consequences of ending security coordination, even if it means repeated Israeli incursions into its territories or the sanction of PA leaders. Acceptance of the PA's continued existence to carry out critical domestic functions, build institutions, and contribute to human development will allow for the establishment of political institutions with new horizons and the articulation of programs that face their hard reality on the ground, in turn strengthening the struggle against apartheid on different fronts. Concerns of Palestinians in Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip and Israel inside. 251. The Green Line are inseparable, given that they all pertain to a single people all living under Israeli sovereignty. In May 2021 protests in solidarity with Jerusalem and Gaza united Palestinian protesters on both sides of the Green Line, but it did not alter the different realities they returned to or the protests subsided. Building economic, educational and health institutions, strengthening structures vital for continued resilience and livelihoods in the West Bank, including Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, Israel, the Arab world and the diaspora, and coordinating these vital elements under the guidance of a political system, all of this is part of the long-term struggle against Israel's apartheid system. Abbas's threat to dissolve the PA in his 1 February 2020 speech to the Arab League or the announcement of the Trump-Netanyahu deal did not represent a new way of thinking or a constructive strategy. It was empty rhetoric of the type that Abbas himself once criticized the Palestinian armed factions for using. In his speech, Abbas said that he had called on their occupation to reassume its responsibilities from the PA. 5. What exactly does that mean? In any case, it was already obvious that Israel would decline his invitation. A real question centers on the role of the PA and the potential political options still available to it in the framework of a coherent liberation strategy, which the current leadership is unable to devise while caught in a convoluted network of subordination to Israel. EPA could continue to operate under such a coherent strategy, but only as a central administrative power facilitating Palestinian autonomy, with local authorities or municipalities managing the population's affairs and providing local police services, absent of any security coordination with Israel, then challenge Israel to dissolve the PA and reoccupy the West Bank. It will not. Instead, Israel will try to influence the PA and meddle and interfere in its internal affairs through intrigue, threat of punishment and promise of reward. Is sort of confrontation needs the combative political spirit of a political elite who recognize that collaboration with Israel will not persuade it to withdraw from the West Bank and grant the PA independence and sovereignty. It will simply reproduce the Bantustan power. To face such challenges, a national liberation movement must be well organized and united. A dissolution of the PA will only lead to the rule of a security apparatus in the West Bank and another in the Gaza Strip without a Palestinian state. 252. However, although the PA's service provision is indispensable, it is not the political leader of the Palestinian people. So while it is necessary to cast aside the notion that the main remit of the PA is to protect the security and stability of Israel, it is also essential to revive the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian collective. Its revival can be real and genuine if it happens as a result of adopting a new vision and includes the new forces in the Palestinian society. If not, it will be a nominal and performative act. I remind the reader that this is a political choice. It can be adopted or rejected. It is neither a theoretical conclusion nor a historical necessity. There are thousands of young activists in Palestine and the diaspora, with no connection to the PA and PLO factions, who are searching for meaningful opportunities to contribute to the liberation struggle. EY are engaged in grassroots initiatives of all sorts, but there is no national framework in place to integrate them. Since the signing of the Oslo Accords and to the present day, the PLO has been systematically hollowed out and stripped of its essence, structure and powers, or perhaps unsystematically, as the unintentional result of the PA's growing importance. It is as though the mission of the organization was to fertilize the seed that culminated in the birth of Oslo, or which it could be discarded. Moreover, it seems that it was for this reason alone that Israel recognized the PLO at Oslo. The goal was to exploit the PLO's legitimacy to obtain this element and make it amend its charter, 6 before forcing it to surrender the stage to the PA. A reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas via Arab mediation will not be enough to rebuild the PLO. This can only be done by involving a much broader range of actors. EPLO is the framework necessary to undertake urgent tasks, such as integrating the efforts of the young political and civil activists in Palestine and the diaspora into the struggle. Whatever form the next Palestinian National Council, PNC, takes, and accounting for structural developments since Oslo, it must incorporate the PA's elected Legislative Council and other elected delegates from the diaspora. Various factions, militant parties, unions and civil society organizations should all be brought into the fold. The task of the new PNC is to learn the political lessons of the failure of the Oslo Accords. No time need be wasted arguing about terminating previously signed agreements because, for all practical purposes, Israel has 253 already annulled them. Any clear-eyed assessment of the current conditions of the Palestinian people requires internalizing the fact that there is no negotiated settlement on the horizon. A Palestinian national movement ought to recognize the situation for what it is, an unresolved colonial condition that has taken the form of an apartheid regime. Palestine's visceral symbolic value to Arabs and those in the global south derives from the Israeli regime's militarized settler colonial character. Different Arab people face their own hardships in the form of oppressive regimes and refugee problems, but the Palestinian cause continues to strike a chord with them because it is a colonial issue that impacts the entirety of the Arab region and continues to play a significant role in today's changing geopolitical context, as well as the link between Israel and the authoritarian Arab regimes that rule over them. Is the Palestinian cause a primary issue for Arabs in the wider region? For Arabs as a whole, certainly, but not necessarily for each and every Arab society. For example, it is not a priority for Syrians involved in their own national struggle against despotism to preserve their country. The same can be said of Iraqis confronting sectarianism, corruption and foreign intervention, Egyptians facing military authoritarianism and poverty, the Sudanese, Libyans, Yemenis, the list goes on. But while Arab peoples face their own national difficulties and have their own priorities, Arabs as a group continue to identify Palestine as a priority, making support for the cause a component of Arab identity. 7. Israel threatens the sovereignty of each Arab country through regional interventions that fuel domestic conflicts or by interfering with Arab countries' bilateral relations with their neighbors in Africa and Asia. The region is expected to adhere to conditions determined by Israeli foreign policy and security needs, just as it is continually shaped and divided into extremists and moderates based on Israel's standards. As has been demonstrated in Egypt, Jordan and South Sudan, normalization with Israel does not solve domestic economic or social problems, and the same is true for countries being extorted to normalize their ties with Israel, like Sudan and Morocco. On the contrary, normalization is often the source of social and political crises. Socioeconomic problems are resolved only by democratic processes that not only protect political rights, but also address social justice and human development. 254. It is only natural for any new Palestinian leadership to mobilize support for the Palestinian cause through diplomatic engagement with as many Arab and non-Arab countries as possible, but it cannot neglect public opinion nor appear uninterested in Arab public concerns. Adopting a democratic discourse in the struggle against the Israeli colonial apartheid regime will enable the liberation struggle to reclaim its global credibility. A democratic discourse of justice. Trying to strike a pragmatic pose, Arab regimes normalizing their relations with Israel say, as if it were a shocking revelation, that Israel is a fait accompli. Israel has been an established fact for a long time, much like the Palestinian people and the apartheid regime they face. Those, too, are established facts. One cannot be a true activist for liberation from occupation in the 20th century while also dismissing the suffering of Arab peoples under dictatorship, just as one cannot oppose despotism while dismissing the struggle against racism and the occupation of Arab land. Those who choose not to express a clear position against despotism in the Arab world can at least remain silent. A national liberation movement aligns, at least indirectly through its discourse and goals, with larger public trends demanding democratization in Arab countries. If the Palestinian struggle focuses on ending apartheid structures produced by the settler colonial system in Palestine, then its demands are inherently democratic, just as the ANC's struggle against apartheid in South Africa was inherently based on democratic principles. EPA wants to become a state through negotiations, but without struggling against the Israeli apartheid system on the ground and in regional and international politics. Its strategy cannot be a democratic national liberation framework that unites Palestinians. Moreover, although some may disagree, I insist that the Palestinian state that could have hypothetically emerged from the Oslo path is largely what already exists today, with some modifications plus the purely ceremonial state appellation. A relatively just two-state solution cannot be achieved through negotiation in the absence of struggle. But struggle will not necessarily culminate in a state, Other forms of justice or outcomes may emerge due to Israeli intransigence, American collusion, and irreversible exogenous developments. Those who have fetishized the idea of a state gained through negotiations are unable to perceive this reality. 255. A Palestinian cause is liberation from occupation, racial discrimination and displacement, as well as liberation from Palestinian fragmentation. Only a discourse of democratic justice can combine them and lead a struggle that could change the conditions of the negotiations. Palestine, as a demographic and territorial space, is subjected to varying degrees of land conscription, the usurpation of national character, and systems of surveillance and control by a single Israeli authority. Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Israel, and Jerusalem all strain under the same regime. But their respective circumstances are different, as are their forms of resistance. A refugee issue is part and parcel of this same settler colonial apartheid reality. In 1948, the colonial project enforced ethnic separation through expulsion and displacement, to turn a Jewish minority into a majority, establish a Jewish state, and inherit not only the land, but also the natives. It is no longer possible to envision or implement a solution to the Palestinian question that includes only one subgroup of the Palestinian people. The abject failure of negotiations aiming for just such a solution has demonstrated the monumental absurdity of this ambition. His new strategy requires all Palestinians to engage in the struggle against the Israeli apartheid regime. In turn, this requires a high degree of organization and coordination, without disregarding the specific context and characteristics of each Palestinian subgroup and their forms of resistance. Different Palestinian constituencies do not need to follow the agenda of a single authority, but they do need to struggle under one umbrella organization. It is important to have local leaders who each independently manage the affairs of their own constituency and citizenry, while simultaneously working towards an inclusive national liberation. Palestinian young people, OEN representing the third generation in their diaspora, have proved to be modern, engaged, adept, connected and effective in their host societies. If they were to attempt to establish a political organization, they would immediately be accused of seeking to supplant the PLO. The same dilemma confronts all the political factions now mired in a political impasse. Diaspora initiatives are important because they influence public opinion around the world and demonstrate that the Palestinian collective continues to be involved in the struggle despite the crisis of political leadership. Is 256. 257. Of colonialism, expressed a national presence and popular aspirations, and fostered the emergence of a politically conscious and active youth generation in the refugee camps. However, it did not come anywhere near liberating Palestine, and this must be acknowledged. It forced the question of Palestine onto the agenda but did not receive an answer. In its decadent phase, the armed struggle against Israel was consumed by the deleterious dynamics of armed factional competition and political showmanship. A new reality must be faced, despite the inevitable nostalgia for the days of armed resistance, which warms the hearts of those veterans that struggled loyally and made personal sacrifices despite their mistakes and illusions. It is over. And it cannot be compared to the individual instances of armed activity in the West Bank that hamper the normalization of the occupation, nor to the deterrence forces of Hamas and other movements in Gaza. Isa new phenomena that have arisen in a very different context. The idea of abandoning The two-state solution for a return to the strategy of liberation through armed resistance is therefore a fantasy. Furthermore, it strips the one-state model of any resonance among Arabs and Jews. A single state for all citizens in historical Palestine is not possible without the support of a majority of its Jewish and Arab citizens. It cannot be coercively imposed. Conditions will need to be created to drive the majority towards support for this outcome. While Israel can be forced to withdraw to the borders of 1967 by a combination of factors, Jews and Arabs cannot be forced to live together as equal citizens in one state. That is a different dynamic. Given the current situation in the Arab world, dismantling the Israeli apartheid is a long-term process requiring patience, organization, and the democratization of the discourse. And because the road is so long, it should not simply be a road of sacrifice, but also achievement, marked by the construction of vibrant institutions everywhere Palestinians are found. We are speaking of the life of a people, our all, not the Via Dolorosa. A United state would not be a democratic, secular, assimilationist state as some people might want to believe. The Palestinian people is a politicized national collective that has developed political aspirations linked to a distinct identity combining Arab and Palestinian identity over more than a century. Palestinians have made costly sacrifices for the sake of a homeland and a sovereign entity, and they will continue to preserve their identity, historical narrative, and national symbols. By the same token, the colonial Zionist 258 movement managed to establish state institutions, a national economy, and a national language. That is, an Israeli-Jewish religio-ethnic nationality has been established in Palestine with its own Hebrew language and culture. Is developed at the expense of the Palestinian people as part of a colonial program that was initially based on a quasi-state during the British Mandate in Palestine and subsequently state-based at the end of the Mandate. A state aimed to produce a Jewish nation, but it actually shaped and reproduced a Jewish Israeli nationality that Zionist Israel does not recognize. Israel has a developed economy, a high standard of living, and a political system that is indeed democratic for Jews. Of course, the system continues to embody profound contradictions between the democratic and Jewish character of the state, between a secular lifestyle and religiously dened nationality, between civic participation and colonialism within the same sovereign system, and most fundamentally, between a privileged occupier and an occupied people without rights. A just compromise in the future will need to recognize the existence of these two distinct national characters and aspirations. A thrust of the one-state solution is that the two ethnic groups are no longer separable in practice and cannot live in two separate states, so they must find a way to coexist equally in one. Both Palestinians and Jewish Israelis need to be convinced of this, and that requires persistent struggle. Although the primary purpose of the struggle is to achieve justice for the Palestinian people, who have been stripped of their homeland and subjugated to apartheid, it will require a credible approach to democratic liberation to convince both peoples that justice and equality are in their shared interest. Israeli public opinion is unfortunately moving in the opposite direction. Broader segments of the Israeli public must be addressed to identify more Jewish people ready to cooperate in a struggle that anchors coexistence in justice. Is fundamentally different from current peace dialogues. Palestinian elites should not become sated on a single-state utopia, as though that were the only alternative solution, and thereby infer that the challenge is to demonstrate the failure of the two-state solution. Neither argument is true. It is not the only alternative, and the failure of the two-state solution does not make it inevitable. A more pressing task is to devise a framework for struggle against a settler colonial apartheid system. To achieve justice through national action driven by a democratic program, this 259 framework should be addressed to both Jews and Arabs. While it should be inclusive, it should not whitewash past colonial injustices. Can a political leadership representing the Palestinian liberation movement, superordinate to the two authorities in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, succeed in uniting the Palestinians around such a framework? In the current circumstances, negotiations cannot bring Hamas and Fatah together because neither will give up its limited authority over people and security forces, or its separate international interests, which dictate either direct or mediated negotiations with Israel. Is the trap of non-sovereign authority. The narrow-minded connivity between parties and factions takes precedence over the wider struggle for sovereignty and self-determination. The only path to unity is to read the mission of the Palestinian authorities and turn them into institutions that recognize a common political leadership. As I said earlier, there is no historical necessity here, it is a matter of human choice. But if this does not happen, the status quo may persist despite occasional revolts and cyclical crises, leaving the two authorities more deeply entrenched each cycle. In there will be neither a two-state nor one-state solution, but rather one Israeli state and two Palestinian authorities ruling over an archipelago of Bantustans. I have spoken at length about weaknesses, but what about strengths? The Palestinian cause's main asset is the Palestinian people's presence on their land, their refusal to surrender to the occupation, and Israel's inability to either swallow the Palestinians whole or spit them out entirely. The continued struggle and the ongoing process of institution building in the West Bank and Gaza are two vital paths to reorganize the Palestinian people and strengthen their resilience. The Arab and international solidarity with Palestine demonstrated during the May 2021 protests is proof that the Palestinian cause remains pivotal and continues to provoke regional anger and protests. Additionally, public opinion in Western countries has shifted significantly in favor of justice in Palestine in recent years. As stated in the introduction, this is in part due to the rise of a new generation that places principled moral values above political ideologies and takes a critical stance on global issues. It is also a response to resurgent far-right populism around the world.